The shame is the part you keep hiding, and that is exactly why it keeps you loyal. It sits in your body before it ever becomes a thought, in the tightness of your throat when you see their name, in the way your stomach drops when the phone lights up, in the strange, exhausted stillness after another hurtful message, another cold silence, another moment where you promised yourself, again, that this time you would not let it get to you. And yet it does. It gets to you every time. Not because you are weak, not because you are blind, but because shame has been quietly teaching you that leaving would mean admitting something unbearable, that maybe you were foolish, that maybe you should have known better, that maybe if you walk away now, it will prove they were right about you all along. That is how shame becomes a chain. It does not only say, "You are hurt." It says, "If you leave, everyone will see that you were hurt." And for many people, that feels even worse than the hurt itself. So you stay. You explain. You forgive too quickly. You minimize what happened. You tell yourself it was not that bad. You remember the good moments with almost religious devotion, as if holding on to them can cancel out the damage. You become loyal not because the bond is healthy, but because shame makes you feel that your pain must be hidden, managed, endured, privately carried. And this is where the real trap begins. Because the person who keeps hurting you does not need to fully control you if shame is already doing part of the work. They wound you. You feel ashamed. The shame makes you silent. The silence makes you easier to hurt again. That loop can go on for years. Sometimes the hurting is obvious, a cruel comment, a disappearing act, a betrayal that leaves no room for denial. But sometimes it is much softer on the surface and much more dangerous underneath. They do not always shout. They do not always insult. Sometimes they simply keep you in a state of uncertainty, where you are always adjusting, always guessing, always trying to be the version of yourself that will finally make them safe, kind, consistent, loving. And when they are not safe, kind, or consistent, you begin to blame yourself for noticing. That is shame's genius. It turns awareness into guilt. You start thinking, maybe I am asking too much. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am the difficult one. Maybe I should be more patient. Maybe I should understand their past. Maybe I should not take it personally. Maybe I should be grateful they are still here at all. And every one of those thoughts can sound reasonable while they are actually keeping you trapped. Carl Jung understood something about this kind of trap that people often miss. He saw that we do not only suffer from what happens to us, we also suffer from the hidden meanings we attach to what happens. The psyche does not just record events, it interprets them. It builds a story around them. And if shame is the lens, the story becomes brutal. Not, "I was hurt," but "I am the kind of person who deserves this." Not, "They crossed a line," but "I must have invited this." Not, "This relationship is damaging me," but "If I leave, I will have to face who I became inside it." That last one is often the deepest fear, because staying can be painful, but leaving can feel like exposure. Staying allows you to keep the image that maybe this can still be fixed, maybe you can still be chosen, maybe the old hope is not dead. Leaving means you may have to sit in the raw truth that you have been loyal to pain for longer than you wanted to admit. And shame hates that truth. Shame does not just want you quiet, it wants you loyal to the very thing that wounds you, because loyalty can be used as proof that you are good, patient, forgiving, strong. It lets you imagine that your endurance is noble, and sometimes endurance is noble. But sometimes endurance is just fear wearing a polished face. There is a difference between love and self-erasure. There is a difference between compassion and captivity. There is a difference between understanding someone and making yourself available for repeated harm. The problem is that shame blurs those lines until they almost disappear. You may even notice that you defend the person who hurts you more fiercely than you defend yourself. You explain them to others. You soften the story. You protect their image. You do not want people to know how badly it has affected you, because once they know, the illusion breaks. And once the illusion breaks, you may have to feel the full grief of what you tolerated. That grief is not small. It is the grief of realizing that you were trying to earn safety from someone who only respected your silence. It is the grief of seeing how long you kept hope alive by shrinking your own reality. It is the grief of understanding that your loyalty was not always love. Sometimes it was a survival strategy. This is where the shadow enters the picture. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not just the dark side of a person. It is everything we cannot easily admit about ourselves and still feel worthy. For someone trapped by shame, the shadow often holds rage, need, disappointment, envy, humiliation, and the forbidden wish to say, "You do not get to do this to me anymore." But if you have built your identity around being understanding, good, easy to love, or emotionally strong, then that anger feels dangerous. You may believe that if you let yourself feel it, you will become cruel. So you bury it, you swallow it, you smile through it, you call it maturity. Yet the shadow does not disappear just because you refuse to look at it. It goes underground, and from underground, it influences the whole relationship. You might become more compliant, more apologetic, more anxious to keep the peace, more willing to accept crumbs because asking for a meal feels too bold. And the more you do this, the more the other person learns that your boundaries are flexible, your discomfort is negotiable, your pain is survivable if they just wait long enough. That is not because they are omnipotent. It is because shame has trained you to betray yourself before anyone else has to. Sometimes, the most painful realization is that the person hurting you did not create your silence. They found a silence that was already there. Maybe it was built long before them. Maybe you learned early that love could be withdrawn when you were inconvenient. Maybe you learned that being easy made you safer. Maybe you learned that your needs caused tension, while your sacrifice caused praise. Maybe you learned that being chosen meant being manageable. If that is true, then the current relationship is not only about this person. It is also about an older complex, an emotional knot that was formed long before the present wound. A complex, in Jung's language, is not just a memory. It is a charged inner pattern. It is the way old pain organizes present perception. When it gets activated, you do not merely think about the past. You live from it. Your nervous system reacts as if the old danger is happening again. So when this person withdraws, criticizes, withholds, or keeps you guessing, something older wakes up in you. The child who had to earn attention. The younger self who felt responsible for keeping the peace. The part of you that learned to survive by being useful. The part of you that equated being abandoned with being exposed as unworthy. That is why shame is so effective. It does not only say, "You made a mistake." It says, "This mistake reveals who you really are." And once that belief takes hold, you become easy to govern from the inside. You will tolerate what you would never recommend to someone you love. You will call it complicated when it is actually degrading. You will call it a rough patch when it is a pattern. You will call it patience when it is fear. And the other person may not even need to threaten you directly anymore. The shame does the threatening for them. But here is the deeper truth, and this is where many people misunderstand the pattern. The loyalty shame creates is not always loyalty to the person. Sometimes it is loyalty to the version of yourself that existed before the wound became undeniable. If you leave, you may have to admit that you were not just mistreated, you were also invested. You hoped, you excused, you waited, you kept the door open. You gave chances that never really became change. That is hard to face because shame makes us think that being hurt is one thing, but being hopeful is embarrassing. And so we keep returning, not because the relationship is nourishing, but because leaving would require a new identity. A self that no longer needs the fantasy to survive. Carl Jung would call this a confrontation with the ego. The ego is the part of us that organizes our sense of who we are. It wants coherence. It wants to believe that our choices made sense, that our suffering had a purpose, that our investment was not wasted. So when the truth becomes too painful, the ego often protects itself by clinging harder. It says, maybe if I just understand them better, maybe if I say it differently, maybe if I become less reactive, maybe if I wait a little longer, maybe if I stay calm, they will finally become the person I know they could be. That hope can feel noble, even spiritual, but sometimes It is simply the ego trying to avoid humiliation. Because humiliation is one of the deepest wounds shame can create. Not just being hurt, being made to feel foolish for having hoped. And once humiliation enters the system, loyalty can become a way of defending against it. If I stay, then maybe I was not foolish. If I keep trying, maybe the story is still unfinished. If I remain faithful to the bond, then maybe the pain will eventually prove meaningful. This is why some people stay long after love has turned into a test of endurance. They are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the meaning of having stayed. That meaning can be powerful. It can also be devastating, because every day you remain in a harmful dynamic out of shame, you deepen the very wound you are trying to hide. You teach yourself that your discomfort is not urgent. You teach yourself that your boundaries are optional. You teach yourself that your intuition is less important than your image of being understanding. And slowly, almost quietly, the self begins to withdraw. In Jungian psychology, the self is the deeper organizing center of the psyche, the part that wants wholeness rather than performance. It is not the same as ego. The ego says, "How do I look?" The self asks, "What is true?" The ego says, "How do I keep this together?" The self says, "What is breaking me apart?" When shame dominates, the ego often becomes obsessed with appearances. It wants the relationship to look salvageable. It wants the story to look less painful. It wants your loyalty to be seen as virtue, not fear. But the self does not care about appearances. The self cares about integration. It cares about whether your life is becoming more whole or more divided. And shame divides you. It splits the part that knows the truth from the part that performs okayness. It splits the part that wants to leave from the part that fears being judged for leaving. It splits the part that is angry from the part that wants to remain good. It splits the body from the story. That is why you can say, "I am fine," while your chest feels like it is being held shut from the inside. And that split is exhausting. You may have noticed that after every hurtful interaction, you do not just feel sad. You feel drained, foggy, smaller, sometimes even ashamed of your own emotional reaction. That is because your system is doing two jobs at once, absorbing the wound and protecting the image. One part of you says, "This hurts." Another part says, "Do not make a scene." One part says, "This is not okay." Another part says, "Maybe you are overreacting." One part says, "Leave." Another part says, "But what will people think?" And in the middle of all that internal noise, the person who keeps hurting you remains strangely central. That is the tragedy of shame. It keeps the source of harm at the center of your world, while moving your own needs to the edge. You start measuring your days by their moods. You start reading their tone like weather. You start organizing your nervous system around their availability. You start feeling relief when they are kind, as if kindness is a miracle rather than the minimum. And each time they give you just enough warmth to keep you hoping, the loop tightens. This is why shame can make harmful attachment feel like devotion. But devotion without dignity is not love. It is a wound with a name. There comes a moment, though, when the body begins to tell the truth faster than the mind can deny it. You feel it when your shoulders tense before you even read the message. You feel it when you rehearse your words in advance, trying to avoid upsetting them. You feel it when your stomach turns not from excitement, but from dread. You feel it when your body starts bracing for the next emotional wave. That is not drama. That is information. The psyche often speaks through the body first, especially when shame has made direct awareness too painful. Your body knows when loyalty has turned into self-abandonment. Your body knows when you are trying to stay attached to avoid the shame of separation. Your body knows when the relationship has become a place where you disappear in order to remain. And once you begin to listen to the body, the spell weakens. You may still care. You may still feel tenderness. You may still miss them. But something in you starts to ask a different question. Not, "How do I keep this going?" but, "What is this costing me?" Not, "How do I make them understand?" but, "Why do I keep tolerating what makes me smaller?" Not, "How do I prove my loyalty?" but, "What part of me is terrified to be seen walking away?" That last question matters more than most people realize, because often the real fear is not losing them. It is losing the identity you built around enduring them. Maybe you were the one who could handle anything. Maybe you were the one who loved harder. Maybe you were the one who never gave up. Maybe you were the one who saw the good in them when nobody else did. Maybe you were the one who kept the connection alive when it should have died. That role can feel like purpose. It can even feel holy. But if it is built on shame, it becomes a prison with a beautiful name. This is where Jung's idea of projection becomes important. Projection happens when we place something inside ourselves onto another person and then relate to them as if they carry the whole meaning. In a painful attachment, you may project hope, healing, worth, or rescue onto the person hurting you. They become the screen on which you try to resolve your own inner conflict. You are not only seeing them, you are seeing what you need them to be for your self-image to survive. And because shame is involved, the projection becomes even stickier. You may unconsciously use them to confirm your endurance, your goodness, your capacity to love beyond reason. If they finally change, then your suffering feels validated. If they never change, then at least your loyalty can be worn like a badge. Either way, the relationship remains tied to your self-worth. That is why simple advice often fails. You cannot just tell someone to move on when their psyche is organized around a shame-based bond. You have to understand what the bond is protecting. You have to see what leaving would force them to feel. You have to meet the grief under the loyalty. Because grief is often what shame is guarding. Not just grief over the person, grief over the years, grief over the version of yourself who kept trying, grief over the trust you gave, grief over the fact that you did not become who you hoped you would become in that relationship, grief over the loneliness of being emotionally invested in someone who was not meeting you where you lived. That grief can feel like collapse, but it is also the beginning of truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is cleaner than shame. Shame says, hide. Truth says, look. Shame says, stay loyal to the image. Truth says, honor the wound. Shame says, if you speak, you will be exposed. Truth says, if you do not speak, you will remain divided. This is why boundaries can feel almost unbearable at first, not because they are wrong, but because they interrupt the old identity. A boundary says, I am no longer available for the version of this that keeps hurting me. And if you have spent years being the one who absorbs, explains, forgives, and returns, then a boundary can feel like betrayal. The shame voice will rise immediately. You are being cold. You are being selfish. You are being unforgiving. You are being dramatic. You are throwing away something valuable. But listen carefully. Shame often calls a boundary cruel when it is actually the first honest thing you have done in a long time. The guilt that appears when you set a boundary is not always a sign that you are wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that you are new. New to not explaining yourself. New to not over-functioning. New to not rescuing the person who keeps creating the crisis. New to not confusing endurance with love. And newness feels uncomfortable in a psyche that has been organized around old pain. So, if guilt rises when you begin to protect yourself, do not assume guilt is wisdom. Sometimes, guilt is just the sound of an old pattern losing its grip. The moment you stop feeding the dynamic changes shape. The moment you stop apologizing for your reality, the story loses one of its strongest pillars. The moment you stop trying to make them safe at the expense of your own sanity, you begin to reclaim the part of you that was exiled by shame. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about punishing anyone. It is not about proving a point. It is about ending the private war inside yourself. Because shame keeps you loyal by convincing you that self-protection is morally suspicious. It tells you that if you choose yourself, you are abandoning love. But what it usually means is that you are abandoning the role that let you survive. There is a difference. And once you see that difference, the whole relationship can look different. You may still feel the pull. You may still hear the old excuses. You may still have moments where you want to reach back, explain more, soften more, try once more. That does not mean you are failing. It means the old complex is still active and asking for attention. Do not shame yourself for the pull. Notice it, name it, feel it in the body. Let it pass through without turning it into a command, because the goal is not to become someone who never feels attached. The goal is to become someone who no longer confuses attachment with self-erasure. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself in the comments or in your private notes. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Let that sentence be simple. Let it be private if you need it to be. Let it be the first time you do not dress your pain up as virtue. Because the truth is, shame has kept you loyal long enough. Loyal to the hope. Loyal to the image. Loyal to the fantasy that if you just endure a little more, the wound will become meaningful. But meaning does not come from staying where you are repeatedly diminished. Meaning comes when you finally tell the truth about what it has cost you. And the truth is not ugly. The truth is not a failure. The truth is the beginning of your return. You may not be able to change the past. You may not be able to make them understand. You may not be able to get back the years you spent explaining your own pain to yourself. But you can stop letting shame be the voice that decides what you deserve next. You can stop using loyalty as a mask for fear. You can stop calling self-abandonment devotion. You can stop mistaking endurance for identity. And when you do, something quiet happens. The body unclenches a little. The mind stops rehearsing every conversation. The mirror becomes less accusatory. The phone loses some of its power. The room feels more like your own again. That is not small. That is the beginning of individuation in Jung's sense. The slow, often uncomfortable process of becoming more whole, less split, less governed by the hidden forces that once ran your life from the shadows. Individuation is not becoming perfect, it is becoming truthful. It is the movement from compulsion toward consciousness. And consciousness changes everything, even when nothing outside changes right away. Because once you see how shame has been keeping you loyal to someone who keeps hurting you, you can no longer unsee it. The old pattern may still knock at the door, but now you know what it is asking for. Not love, not loyalty, your self-abandonment, and you do not have to answer. You can let the silence be what it really is. Not punishment, not a performance, not a game, but the place where you finally hear your own voice again. That voice may be quiet at first. It may not sound heroic. It may not know exactly what comes next. But it will know the difference between being chosen and being used. It will know the difference between compassion and captivity. It will know the difference between staying and surrendering yourself. And once that voice returns, shame loses its throne. You do not need to become harder to be free. You only need to become honest enough to stop calling pain by a softer name. That is how the chain breaks. Not all at once, not with drama, not with revenge. It breaks when you tell the truth to yourself and do not turn away. It breaks when you let dignity be louder than fear. It breaks when your loyalty finally comes home to you.